Hitler's darkest secrets and most terrifying weapons. Lost below the waves until now.
How did hundreds of lethal submarines simply vanish at the conclusion of World War II, only to be discovered in excellent condition in the deep sea decades later?
A new stealth weapon brings terror to the oceans.
This is a dirty war.
Evidence of a naval revolution lost for a century beneath the storm-ravaged seas of the British Isles.
When the Allies opened them and discovered odd goods, hidden technology, and indications of an unending conflict, the world was astonished. These were more than just submarines. Beneath them were clever and terrifying time capsules. Let's discover what lies beneath the seas. The surrender of the Steel Wolves in May 1945, the sounds of German U-boats hunting abruptly stopped. Hitler had passed away. Germany was disintegrating. Across the Atlantic, hundreds more submarines continued to skulk beneath the seas, waiting for orders that would never come. In those steel cells, the crews survived on terror and stale air. Their radios were transmitting fragments of a dying order, half-words, and broken signals. The large fleet of U-boats that had previously attacked ships from Norway to the Caribbean had no boss and no purpose, or a future. To learn more, a few captains ascended to the summit. Others remained below, unsure of whether rising to the top would result in freedom or death. The end of the war was not communicated to the sea. Then, on May 8th, a final signal emerged from the clutter. Hitler's choice to lead the Allies was Admiral Karl Dönitz, who ordered all U-boats to cease combat, surface, and surrender to the nearest Allied force. After 6 difficult years of fighting underwater, the wolves of the Atlantic were returning home. Black-painted ships broke through the water in the frigid North Atlantic, the Norwegian fjords, and the Bay of Biscay. Periscopes were built first, followed by conning towers. Men ascended into they hadn't seen such dazzling sunlight in months. They attached white sheets and undershirts to antennae as a sign that they were prepared to surrender. The Allied aircraft's cannons were prepared, but they failed to fire. Now that the chase was over, the gunmen were being pursued. The sight of dozens of submarines emerging simultaneously, their motors coughing, and their crews silently standing on deck was unprecedented for the Allies. The water glistened with the reflections of abandoned U-boats in harbors from Denmark to France, from Trondheim to Kiel. Each told a unique tale of missing soldiers, unaccounted for convoys, and a war waged in the dark. The British Navy's portion of the operation was called Pledge. The objective was simple but crucial. Locate every submarine that has surrendered, monitor it, and ensure that it didn't sink. Royal Navy destroyers and Canadian corvettes swept in like shepherds, leading lines of submarines to surrender ports such as Portland on the English coast, Lissahalli in Northern Ireland, and Loch Arabole in Scotland. As the convoys arrived, locals observed from the hills. Diesel smells hovered over the placid sea, and the black hulls resembled ghost ships. About 40 U-boats dropped anchor only at Loch Arabole. From bow to stern, their sleek forms were arranged like a funeral procession. Hundreds of German sailors were shown on camera, standing motionless on the deck, while Allied boarding squads approached with rifles drawn and prepared. Each submarine served as a weapon and a treasure trove. The first thing that needed to be done was to enter. Sailors from the United States and Great Britain scaled tiny apertures into the greasy, musty insides. Among other things, they photographed the engine blocks, the torpedo chambers, and the gauges. They obtained the maps, charts, and code sheets before German soldiers could destroy them. Every discovery was recorded, sealed, and forwarded to Navy intelligence. What they saw stunned them. At the time, the engineering was well ahead of everything else on the ocean. The machinery was packed like a clock. The wires were insulated and carefully tied together, and the labels on the valves were written in extremely precise script. After the fact, a British expert claimed that these submarines were constructed more like watches than like ships. Even when they were losing, German design was always extremely accurate. Because they were identical to those discovered on U-565, the submarine that the USS Navy took the entire year prior. Some of Germany's naval defenses had already been breached by that first prize. It became evident that the Allies controlled the Atlantic as additional logs and Enigma devices arrived. The instruments the wolves used to conceal their footprints were now evidence that they had been apprehended. Soldiers and sailors who had been attempting to murder one another for months crowded the decks outside. Now, when they were close to one another, they exchanged thoughtful glances but remained silent. Many of the German submariners were hungry and exhausted, and many of them were under 20 years old. They surrendered their weapons, went ashore, and formed a line to be treated as POs. When they gave up, some felt relieved, while others felt ashamed. The majority of people don't survive what they did. Of the 40,000 men who served in U-boats throughout the war, 3 out of 4 never returned. The survivors on these final boats realized how fortunate they were. Instead of winning the battle they fought in the dark beneath the sea, they were exhausted. Allied harbors were overflowing with captured submarines by July. The periscopes sprang up like a forest of steel, with rows of them tied next to one another. British officers took stock while engineers discussed how to handle this massive ship. Do they need to keep them? Take a look at them. Throw them away. One thing was certain, though. These subs contained the future plans. Every boat was a conundrum. Some were empty, while others were loaded with advanced equipment. And some were designed to blow up by themselves. Teams from the Allies discovered a variety of items there, including test controllers for torpedoes and encrypted radio transmitters. It was impossible to overlook the irony when an American officer reportedly referred to it as a goldmine of German engineering. These submarines used to be the most hazardous thing in the Atlantic. They were currently researching awards and projects. Their machines were left out for others to examine while they were incarcerated. Once the soldiers aboard their ships used periscope sights to observe Allied ships. What had been concealed was suddenly visible. What was once frightening was now just equipment that needed to be deciphered. However, before they could delete these machines from history, the Allies decided to have one final look at them. What they discovered in the dim, silent corridors of those ships would astound even the men who had battled those U-boats. Operation Deadlight by the end of 1945. Britain's harbors resembled dilapidated junkyards rather than docks. From the Scottish coast to Northern Ireland, the docks were packed. The faded emblem of Hitler's navy was shown on each of the steel boats arranged next to one another. There were 156 U-boats that had surrendered, and they were turning into an issue that nobody wanted to handle. Fuel, oil, and salt water entered already full anchorages as they sank. Their bodies were decaying rapidly, and their batteries were failing. Even when they were still, they posed a threat. Chemical and mechanical hazards were trapped in British seas. In addition to the technological problem, there was a political one. These submarines, which represented Nazi authority, continued to operate freely with designs from other nations even after the war was finished. Maintaining them is expensive. Letting them go was dangerous. Every nation that had battled Germany desired a piece of its technology, and nobody wanted another nation to gain power as a result. For this reason, Britain took a decision that altered the ocean floor's shape. In the fall of 1945, the Royal Navy discussed a scheme known as Operation Deadlight. It's brutal. The objective was to sink every U-boat that surrendered by dragging it out into the Atlantic. Erase rather than disassemble or use again. The architects intended to bury all of the hazardous machines that were produced during the conflict at sea. It was difficult to believe how large it was at first. Of the 156 U-boats that were caught, 116 were dispatched to be destroyed. The sophisticated models, such as the Type 21 and 23, were preserved for further analysis. They were dispersed throughout the USSR, the UK, and the US. However, the outcome for the other soldiers who served in the Atlantic War was different. Sailors began preparing the fateful Armada in Lusahalli, in Northern Ireland, and Loch Ryan, in Scotland. Each submarine was assigned a number, its weapons were removed, and its fuel was depleted. You could hear the smash of waves on rusting steel and the grinding of chains in the docks. Tugboats were prepared to transport the elderly murderers out to sea for the final time. They were heading to 3 dumps that were only identified as X, X, YY, and ZZ on Royal Navy maps. These were located between 100 and 120 nautical miles northwest of Ireland. They would perish in the open on the Atlantic. In November 1945, WWII's maiden fleet sailed. The strategy appeared to be straightforward. Extract a number of submarines, sink them, and then return. The sea, however, had other ideas. Before they surrendered, many of these U-boats had been submerged for months. Their engines would not start. Their bodies were thin, and their metal was worn out. They were ghosts kept together by corrosion and bolts. They were no longer ships. When the winter storms arrived, those ghosts began to retaliate. Tug workers had to deal with waves that were higher than houses. Chains shattered under the strain, allowing subs to escape one by one. Before they reached their assigned locations, a few of them unexpectedly sank beneath the water. A few overturned and vanished into the tempest. The Royal Navy never attempted to save anyone, but they did record every loss. There was one fewer object to drag with each downed ship. Before they ever reached the target locations, more than 50 boats had already sunk by February 1946. The sea interrupted the silence. For those who survived the journey, the conclusion was swift and depressing. The Royal Navy's ships and frigates circled like murderers once they were in position. Some submarines were sunk by direct gunfire, which sent shells through steel and reverberated across empty waves. Others were destroyed by explosives buried deep within, or they were sunk by opening sea valves and allowing the Atlantic to pour in. The sailors present witnessed something both breathtaking and terrifying. Massive hulls slowly sinking, bubbles rising, and metal groaning as the pressure caused it to bend and shatter. In a matter of minutes, there were no more submarines on the ocean floor. They all disappeared into the night, never to be seen again. Among them was U-236. Before they surrendered, it was the final German submarine to sink an Allied vessel. It survived the war, but its captors intentionally killed it in January 1946, just before Christmas. Another, U-295, sank. Without any trouble, it was removed from Loch Ryan and scuttled. There were no inscriptions or flags, only coordinates scribbled down in ink. By early spring, the work was nearly finished. Sonar and depth charges were no longer present in the Atlantic. It had turned into a steel graveyard. In the chilly salt water beneath the surface, over 100 submarines were flawlessly preserved. They belonged to a fleet that was obliterated from existence, but not from history. For many years, Operation Deadlight was forgotten. The locations of the dumping zones were left to collect dust in military records because the world had moved on after the war. Fishermen occasionally hooked their nets on odd forms in deep water, but they didn't give it much thought. This region of the North Atlantic was adept at keeping its secrets. 50 years later, the water was no longer silent. A team headed by marine archaeologist Enos McCartney searched for the missing submarines between 2001 and 2003. They used deep-sea cameras and advanced sonar to examine the seafloor, close to the original dump locations. What they saw on their televisions stunned everyone. The ships remained in place. It appears that almost a dozen U-boats are merely resting on the waiting for more orders at the ocean's bottom. While some had their periscopes exposed, others still had their torpedo tubes closed. They resembled odd iron and historical reefs because barnacles and coral had developed on their bodies. Many of their identification numbers were still visible 50 years later. And the chilly dark water had done a fantastic job of maintaining their decks in excellent condition. The images stunned historians. Eliminating all traces of Germany's submarine fleet was the aim of Operation Deadlight. Rather, it created one of the world's largest underwater graveyards. Every wreck served as a time capsule containing a pristine, still moment from 1945. These steel tombs held the final secrets of the U-boat conflict. Everything was sealed. Tools, clothing, navigational maps, and even ration boxes were all silently raised. Statues from a conflict that claimed many lives are now hundreds of feet underwater, hidden from view. Beneath the rust and devastation, the Allies discovered technology that was decades ahead of its time. Because these devices were so sophisticated, both the East and the West would struggle to keep their secrets. They discovered preparations for the upcoming conflict in addition to loot within the U-boats they captured. The technological jackpot before the water engulfed them. They opened the U-boats like treasure boxes. Each captured submarine was examined by engineers and Navy personnel to see what made it so hazardous. The devastation of Operation Deadlight was postponed only long enough for a final inspection. A final opportunity to discover the contents of the enemy's most secret weapon. What they discovered astounded them. The contents of the pressure tanks were far more sophisticated than anything produced during the conflict by the Allies. The Germans developed submarines that could move more forcefully, stay underwater longer, and be difficult for sonar to detect. It was like traveling to the future for the engineers who had to crawl through those narrow steel corridors. Among the items discovered was the Type 21, a svelte and inventive design that revolutionized everything. It was intended to travel quickly underwater as well as on the surface. It was a submarine designed to live underwater rather than merely dive for cover. It could stay underwater for days thanks to its massive batteries, which were recharged by a novel breathing mechanism known as a mask. The engines continued to work while the sub remained hidden thanks to this little hose that carried air in from above. It was unlike anything that Marines from all across the world had ever seen. It was accompanied by the Type 23, a smaller coastal version designed for quick, short travels. It was the forerunner of all subsequent diesel-electric submarines. It was compact, silent, and effective. Experts from the US and the UK took pictures of every component of these vessels. They disassembled panels to examine the composition of the steel, examined how the propeller's forms affected the water's movement, and experimented with the rubber tiles that covered a portion of the Hullerly attempts at soundproofing. Even the control room's layout, which was straightforward, practical, and designed to operate fast under duress, satisfied them. In order to conduct research, the sunk submarines were arranged in sheds and dry docks throughout Britain. Teams replicated valve designs, documented wiring layouts, and disassembled engines to determine how German engineers managed to pack so much power into such a tiny area. Although the Allies had won the war, they were aware that they had lost the competition to develop fresh concepts. Thus, a new agreement known as the Tripartite Naval Commission was reached in August of 1945. The US, UK, and USSR were to split the captured fleet. 10 U-boats were given to each person to study, and they were all quite interested in learning what mysteries remained inside. In Britain, U-3017 was repurposed as HMSN for one, in order to determine how far its strengthened skin could flex before breaking. It was tested by diving as deep as feasible. Canada utilized U-190 as a target for radar and torpedo drills off the coast of Newfoundland. In the U.S., the long-range U-234 created quite a sensation. It was intercepted en route to Japan, carrying many tons of uranium oxide, plans for cutting-edge weaponry, and parts for jet engines. After Hiroshima, The Americans were well aware of the potential consequences of this substance. One by one, Soviet specialists disassembled their portion of the Type 21 boats in the east. They were able to locate every rivet and weld, and soon Russian shipyards were producing entirely new submarines. They were known as the Whiskey class and came from Germany. On the other side of the Atlantic, Americans were acting in a similar manner. The Guppy Initiative, which produced the U.S. the Type 21's design, served as the model for submarines that remain longer underwater. These designs served as the foundation for the Tang class, the first genuinely modern American warship. 10 years later, when nuclear propulsion emerged, the new ships continued to be based on the overall design of the German hulls that had been taken. The irony that both sides of the Cold War were now using gears manufactured in Hitler's factories was difficult to ignore. The Allies exploited more than just robots. Along with the submarines came the minds behind them. Through programs like Operation Paperclip, German metallurgists, naval engineers, and propulsion specialists were employed after being secretly questioned. They traveled to the US, the UK, and even the USSR. The same individuals who labored to destroy Allied ships were now producing submarines for the victorious side. There was a moral gray area when it came to employing knowledge from a war predicated on murder to rebuild peace. Furthermore, not all of the material discovered in the U-boats was scientific. After compiling a catalog of every tool, the engineers began looking for the smaller, more peculiar items. They discovered ceremonial daggers, iron eagle emblazoned clothing, propaganda pamphlets in English intended to dissuade Allied sailors, and private journals on maritime life. There were still some crates with unopened supplies, rusting firearms, and photos of abandoned families. These pieces revealed a deeper aspect, the human side of the combat machine, and so, beneath the cold Atlantic, the steel wolves still sleep silent, untouched, and filled with secrets the world never expected to find. What began as weapons of terror became time capsules of a war that refused to die. Their engines may be silent, but their story is far from over.